Now, to help us understand what these new satellites could mean for Nigeria's communications infrastructure, digital security, and wider strategic interest, we're now joined from Nairobi in Kenya by lawyer and cyberspace analyst Jed Oyeneye. Mr. Oyeneye, thank you so much for your time. I'd like to know how significant is this move for Nigeria's digital sovereignty, particularly at a time when communications and data security are becoming national security issues?
Yeah, good evening, and thank you for having me. You're mentioning digital sovereignty and national security. It's very pertinent to know that communication satellites are classified as very critical national infrastructure. They sit alongside power grids of financial systems and all those frameworks. So it's usually classified as critical national infrastructure, and of course, it should get that kind of regulatory oversight. But you see, the important thing to note here is sovereignty. There are three levels of sovereignty when it has to do with satellites. The first thing is ownership. That's level one. Who owns the assets? Or whose name does the assets bear? Then the second thing is operational control. Who commands and controls the day-to-day? And of course, the third thing is the data sovereignty. Whatever data that is being transmitted through the satellites, where does it sit and who can access it? You see, when we go down history lane, you see that NigComSat-1 and then 1R, we had a very terrible experience with it because Nigeria only owned the satellite, and the second and third layers, the ground control and the data sovereignty was really in China for 8 years. And of course, I'm pretty sure you know that at some point the Chinese company said we were owing them as much as 43 million US dollars because they really were holding control for that long. So I think what is going to be very, very important here is to be sure, right? So for the Federal Economic Council, we should be sure exactly what the terms of this contract states, because we don't want it to be like NigComSat-1, where it was only named Nigerian. It was only named Nigerian, but we really did not have so much control over it, and even the data sovereignty and whatnot. One of the things that is going to test whether we've learned from the failures of NigComSat-1, if you will, is whether we'll be able to domestically control these satellites, and whether in terms of time redundance and all those things, whether it would be in our hands. I'm pretty sure you also know that in 2018, there was an issue where a lightning strike actually damaged the control, and since then it had been in China. So for data sovereignty, for control, it's really going to be a test of what is inside the contract between Nigeria and the French and the Israeli company.
Now, Jed, what we know is Nigeria is partnering with Israel and French companies. What cybersecurity and data protection safeguards should be built into these satellite projects from the onset?
Okay. If you are working with a different country, one thing you must know is that they won't export their own technology. They would only show you, this is what we are doing. They won't really let you see it. But one of the things we need to look at is data localization. No matter what, the command and control of this satellite must be resident in Nigeria. Then the second thing is source code or firmware escrow. So this means that where is this data sits with, so that we can employ independent security audits, because it's important that if you are the controller of data, if you're the controller of a particular system, you must be able to audit it. So these things must be written into the contract. Of course, there's also encryption. There's encryption. So whatever encryption keys are, Nigeria must own those encryption keys, because if we don't own those encryption keys, it's more or less like we actually don't own this satellite we're talking about. Then very, very critical is supply chain vetting, because the hardware components that build up these satellites, they are supplied by private companies, more or less. So we have to make sure that these companies that are supplying these hardware components, we are they are properly vetted. You understand how difficult it is to get companies that are not partisan these days. You understand if you are getting something from a US company, you must be sure that the US government doesn't have control over those parts. If you are getting something from a Chinese, you must be sure that the Chinese government don't have it. If you're getting something from the French government, you must be sure that the French government don't have a say in the day-to-day workings of it. And of course, the last thing I might like to mention is technology transfer clause. So if you read the statement by the minister, they mentioned something regarding knowledge transfer. You say, I believe knowledge transfer is not a thing, right? If you are not going to explain how you are going to really transfer the knowledge in terms of the number of engineers to be trained, whether Nigeria is going to own the IP, that's intellectual property, or local assembling of all these things. Knowledge transfer is just, I think, it's just aspirational language. Then lastly, incident response is very, very important. Incident response and breach notification. We have the NDPA, that's 2023. It basically is saying that whenever there's maybe a breach or maybe a data incident or something like that, a security incident, we must get to know. You understand? So the challenge is that the country where these satellites control be located, they also have their own data laws. So will our own data laws overshadow their own data laws, or will their own data laws overshadow our own? So a lot of things still have to be considered. Right. You understand?
All right, so tell me, Jed, what does the deployment of the NigComSat-2A and 2B potentially mean for ordinary Nigerians, particularly when we're looking at, broadband access in underserved and rural communities?
Okay, I like the fact that you're mentioning broadband access, because I believe strongly that aside from the regular government functions, one of the things that is very, very important for we, the regular Joe on the streets, is broadband penetration. Currently, we're at 40%, and the NCC is looking at 70%, 75%. And of course, one of the reasons why we have the satellites is to ensure that we can increase this. You understand? Normally, we have the terrestrial method of getting broadband, that's using fiber optic cables and whatnot. But you see, for private companies, the M10s and co., it's not very profitable for them to have terrestrial infrastructure in places like in the Niger Delta creeks, or maybe as far north as in Borno or those other places. They may not necessarily look commercially attractive. But you see, having the satellite is a way to assist it. But it's important to also note that satellites cannot replace terrestrial infrastructure. Even by global standards, you need to have terrestrial infrastructure and then supported by satellites. It's important to also note that the fact that the satellite is there and has the capability doesn't mean it's going to be cheap, right? It doesn't mean it's going to be cheap, because the NigComSat transponders is really what is going to determine whether it's going to provide cheap internet or expensive. So, as I mentioned, it still goes down into the wordings of the contract. But I believe strongly that the average Nigerian, the average Joe should be able to get cheap internet if this thing goes right.
All right, we actually hope for it. We hope that actually happens, Jed. But now we're talking about satellites that could support government communications, healthcare, education, and even agriculture. I'd like to know, how vulnerable could such critical infrastructure become to, cyber attacks, espionage, or even deliberate disruption?
Yeah, so first things first, we say when you put all your eggs in one basket, the problem is that once that basket goes down, everything goes down with it. So the fact that we are putting government comms, health, education, agri, finance, and all those things into just one single basket of the NigComSat-2, it means that we are making the attack surface even way easier. So imagine that the satellite gets attacked. Everything that it bears, health, education, agri, finance, government comms, and whatnot, everything goes down. But there are three realistic threats here. The first thing is signal jamming. It's very, very common. It's becoming even cheaper to actually jam signals. And then the second thing we want to look at is ground segment compromise. In 2018 in Abuja, they said it was reported that there was a thunder strike right, that affected the local infrastructure. So that's another thing to talk about. And earlier I mentioned supply chain compromise during manufacturing. We have to put so much attention to these things, because if while you are manufacturing, there's already a breach, a country, probably, I don't know what nation is going to be, already has a foothold into the production of the satellite. Of course, forever, they would always have access to it, and we need to mention it. And then, of course, espionage risk is becoming more and more pronounced, because if it's a foreign government that is assisting in putting this thing up, your guess is as good as mine. I don't want to say more than that, but your guess is as good as mine.
All right, thank you so much, Jed Oyeneye, for, of course, creating time for us on the news.